Hello, everybody. I am Tatiana Bazzichelli from the Disruption Network Club in Berlin, and I'm very happy to introduce now the second panel of the day of our conference in cooperation between Germany and Georgia, Hate News versus Free Speech. This panel has the title Misinformation on Social Media During Elections. And I'm also very happy to say that has been a great cooperation together with Transparency International. For this specific panel, we have a hybrid format. So we have two speakers and the moderator here in Berlin with us at the Kunstquartier Bethanien. And then we have one speaker connected on streaming in Georgia. So Varoon, Bashyakarla, and Rafael Goldzweig are here with us, and Eka Rostomashvili as well, and Mikheil Benidze is instead connected in Tbilisi. This is also important to say because our audience is online and can follow us on streaming and also interact with the speakers. So please remember that we have a chat. You can ask questions to the speakers, and then the question will be referred at the end of the panel. So I would like now to introduce Eka, that has been with us already in the past for the first conference of this year. Eka Rostomashvili leads Transparency International campaigning to disrupt cross-border corruption, particularly on the heels of cases uncovered by investigative journalists. She previously worked at Transparency International chapter in her native Georgia, where she heavily contributed to the group's campaigning for progressive reforms and government accountability. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Eka. Thanks for being with us, all the speakers, and I will come back then for the final greetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It was a real pleasure for Transparency International to partner with you as part of the Art of Exposing Injustice conference series during the last 2 years. And it is also a pleasure for me to be here now. For the members of the audience who do not know Transparency International, we are a global anti-corruption movement with presence in over 100 countries, including in Georgia and Germany. And at the International Secretariat, where I work, we conduct cutting-edge research to measure corruption, but also conduct global advocacy to disrupt cross-border corruption, as Tatiana has already said, among other things. Corruption is often understood very narrowly as bribery within public sector, but we define corruption as abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And we have been increasingly exploring ways to address the unchecked power over our lives that is held by large companies, including big tech. Not only the internet is changing the way we think and make decisions in the social sphere, but people around the world are increasingly becoming worried about the ways social media could be influencing how we elect our decision makers, the mechanism for entrusting the power in our democracies, to circle back to our definition of corruption. So our second panel will break down what we know about the ways that information is manipulated in our digital spaces. We'll talk a lot about Georgia, but also look at the trends elsewhere and debate solutions. And we're privileged to have with us an excellent lineup of speakers. Truly, we could not have wished for a better panel to have this conversation with. Our first speaker, Varoon Bashyakarla, comes from the United States. Before moving to Berlin in 2017, Varoon worked in Silicon Valley at a financial technology firm, Wealthfront, followed by a gig at Dropbox. Now he's busy studying how personal data is becoming a political asset, influencing elections and referenda with Tactical Tag, an excellent Berlin NGO. Some of our viewers in Georgia might know Varoon. In 2018, he spoke at DataFest Tbilisi, which was organized by our friends at Forset, another excellent Georgian NGO, and then again a few months ago, earlier this year. Today, he will tell us about how the digital influence industry works and what are some of the infrastructural problems that allow personal data to be weaponized for political purposes. The floor is yours.
Ika, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to Disruption Lab for having me here today. I'm speaking today on misinformation on social media during elections, and I thought I would start with just a brief expectation setting. Much of the attention on this topic has been focused around these three realms. On Facebook, first and foremost, much of the scholarship and thinking around the problems associated with this issue have been focused on the United States. And there's been, of course, a lot of attention focused on disinformation. At Tactical Tech, we decided very early on, since when we started studying this topic about 3.5 years ago, to look at everything outside of this space. So instead of looking at Facebook specifically, we're looking at the industry at large. Instead of looking at just the US, we're looking at this issue globally. And we're not focused explicitly on disinformation itself, but rather how personal data is being used in political ways, even without any agenda to spread disinformation. Over the course of this work, we've worked closely with journalists and academics and civil society organizations and technology researchers across a number of countries, most closely with the countries listed here. And if you look at the list, you'll see that Georgia is not on the list. However, I hope today I can explain to you why learning what's happening around the world, including in these other countries, is important to helping understand what's happening in Georgia and how personal data is being weaponized for political purposes, and ultimately what that means too for the role disinformation plays in elections in this day and age. Over the course of this work, my colleagues and I have identified hundreds of companies around the world that are using personal data in political ways. This slide shows just a few of their homepages. People often think that Cambridge Analytica was an exception. In many ways, it actually wasn't. There are hundreds of companies around the world using personal data for political purposes in opaque ways. Cambridge Analytica, of course, was just highly sensationalized, but there are hundreds of companies around the world that do this. And my colleagues and I have called this collection of companies the influence industry. And of course, you might be wondering, what in the world do these companies do? We've classified the work of these companies into three broad categories, sort of three families of technologies. At the bottom are issues around how our personal data has become a political asset. Secondly, how it's being used as a source of political intelligence. And finally, how that information in turn is used as a form of political influence, as an instrument of political influence, really. Now, as a data scientist, I prefer to think of this hierarchy a little bit differently. I think of the bottom layer as the acquisition layer. Where are you getting your data from? The layer above that, the analysis layer. What can you learn from the data that you've collected? And finally, the application layer. How can you use the learnings from the data that you've collected to actually help advance a political goal that you have? And first, we'll go through a couple of examples in each of these three categories, and we'll first start with this asset layer. Like I said earlier, asset is all about the acquisition of data. Around the world, a lot of countries have voter rolls. This is basic information with voters' names, address, phone numbers sometimes, and often in practice that's complemented with information from the consumer sector. But there's also one big source of voter data that's often overlooked, and that is leaked, breached, and hacked voter data. As campaigns become more data-driven around the world, voter data has become increasingly politically valuable. And we're all familiar with leaks, breaches, and hacks in everyday consumer tech. It's a big problem, as we know. It turns out that it's also a big problem with political tech. In fact, many of the same companies making consumer tech are also in the business of political tech. There's a lot of money nowadays to be made from meeting the digital demands of political campaigns, and so a lot of private companies that one day had nothing to do with politics, that were making just everyday consumer tech, are now making technology for political campaigns. And we see there that just as the market has undervalued security and privacy in the world of consumer tech, that's being mirrored now with political tech, even though the information that is being stored through political technologies is obviously highly sensitive. And so here are just 3 concrete examples from around the world. In 2017, there was a leak in the United States. A misconfigured database led to the leaking of about 200 million American voters' personal data, including information on their predicted ethnicity and religion. On the right, you see a screenshot from the Election Commission in the Philippines, which suffered from what's been called one of the biggest government-related data breaches in history. Its website was subject to a cyber attack, and at the same time, another website popped up with a 340 gigabyte file containing the personal details of 55 million Filipino voters, including information on their passport details and fingerprint data. And the screenshot you see here was placed there by the group that claimed responsibility for the breach, Anonymous Philippines. And so instead of the Commission of the Philippines election website, you saw instead this. In 2016, there was a hack in Turkey, a 6.6 gigabyte file with Turkish citizenship data was released containing information on 50 million voters. What you see here is Turkey's communication minister dismissing the hack, saying it was old news. It seems like the data that was then released actually came from 2008, but a Turkish privacy activist, having looked up the information, found his own information there. He found his own family's information and said, even if this came from 8 years ago, I still have the same name, my address is the same, my parents still have the same name, our phone numbers are the same, all our contact information is the same. And we see this issue as well in Georgia. So in October of 2019, the websites of the Georgian's President's Administration's website, city halls and councils, the courts, some media outlets, and even some NGOs were subject to an attack. The US, Georgia, and the UK all ended up blaming the GRU. And instead of seeing the home pages of these websites when you visited their websites, instead users were greeted with this photo of Mikheil Saakashvili, the Georgian ex-president, with the banner at the top saying, "I'll be back." Earlier this year as well, there was quite a big, what appeared to be data breach in Georgia, as the headline says. Personal details for the entire country of Georgia were published online. It was initially suspected that this information came from the Central Election Commission in Georgia, but later this appeared not actually to be the case. It's still actually unknown where this information came from, but some experts say that it was just posted online just to undermine voters' faith in elections. It looks like the file itself, even though it was just released this year, originally came from August 2011. So there's this kind of similarity with what happened in Turkey, that this data that was breached historically or in the past still has this sort of everyday modern relevance with politics today. That was just a quick run through of the asset layer. Let's now move on to the intelligence layer. Intelligence, like I said earlier, was all about collecting information, analyzing information from the data that you've amassed. This is really about the mass testing of communications, of designs, of photos to desire some sort of engagement that you're interested in, whether that's clicks, whether that's donations or signups. And it's ultimately about what voters respond to. So I thought it would be helpful here to just look at a couple of examples from around the world. We're looking specifically at one family of technologies that is experimentation. It's called A/B testing in the industry. So you see here 3 ads that were run in India on Facebook with Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, and they all have the same photo of Modi doing namaste, but if you look closely, the text on the photos is different. It's very likely here that the Modi campaign was running different variations of this ad to see which one was driving the engagement that they wanted. You see here as well a couple of examples from the United States. On the top are 3 different photos during Bernie Sanders' birthday party during his presidential run in 2016. And the campaign here is likely testing which photo of Bernie leads to more voters handing over their voter information, their email address ultimately, to sign up to Bernie Sanders' email list. Very similarly with Ben Carson during his 2016 campaign for president, you see a similar thing. Two identical photos of him next to different pieces of text. The campaign is testing here which piece of text is more effective in getting more voters to sign up to their email list, in turn probably to send them emails to ask for donations to the campaign. You see here an example from the Obama campaign. Here was an experiment run on his fundraising pages, and the sequential flow on the right, it turned out, instead of one long piece of text where users entered all of their payment information at once, this sequential flow actually led to a 5% increase in donations. So this stuff is tested across the board. And here's a quote from Gary Kobe, the former director of digital advertising and fundraising for the Trump 2016 campaign. He said, the quote is from an article in Wired that's quoting Gary Kobe. On any given day, Kobe says, the campaign was running 40,000 to 50,000 variants of its ads. On the day of the third presidential debate in October, the team ran 175,000 variations. Gary Kobe calls this A/B testing on steroids. Now, I used to run an A/B testing team at a Silicon Valley company, and I have to say that this volume of testing is totally unprecedented. And you can see how testing on the scale allows campaigns to test messaging and images and headlines and slogans on a level of mass granularity. I thought just for fun it would be interesting to have you think for a second which of these two photos the Trump campaign tested actually was more successful in getting supporters to sign up for an email list that they had. And if you guessed the top photo, you are correct. It was actually more successful than the bottom one. But here they were testing this banner image on the Trump website. And we see something similar happening in Georgia. Here you see two photos of Boris Ivanishvili, the leader of the Georgian Dream Party. Here, the texts on the ads are identical. The videos, in fact, are identical. One of the ads has slightly more money spent on it and has a greater reach. But it turns out that these identical ads were targeted at different parts of the country. So one of the ads was targeted to voters in the western region of Georgia, and one was targeted at people in Tbilisi. This isn't necessarily a sign of anything devious or wrong, but you can imagine how testing like this allows campaigns to learn things about where voters are more sympathetic to their message, what causes in different regions of the country people care more about, and even things like what issues to talk about when you as a politician go campaigning around different parts of the country. Now on that note, I thought it would be helpful to just set some baselines. Since November of 2020 in Georgia, social issues, elections, and politics have seen about 20,000 ads across the country and about $1 million spent. You're likely wondering, how is it possible that campaigns, even those of extreme technological sophistication, end up with as many as 175,000 variants, as Kobe mentioned? So I thought, of course, as this is a panel about social media and elections, it would be helpful to just look at a promotional video from Facebook itself so you can see for your own self how some of this infrastructure works beneath the hood. So without further ado, I'll play this promotional video from Facebook.
How can you get maximum value from your Facebook ads? By knowing that when it comes to the creative, it's never one size fits all. Great creative finds the perfect match between your ad and your audience. For example, Tony lives in Singapore and enjoys taking his four-wheeler for a spin on the weekends. Simone lives in Marseille and loves her motor scooter. People like Tony and Simone are likely to respond to different types of ad creative. But what if you're an automaker who wants to promote the same car model on Facebook to both of them? You'd have to test different creative components, such as images, headlines, and call to action buttons in your ads to determine which ones get the best response. A time-consuming and costly process. Introducing Dynamic Creative. It's a new way to ensure the right ad creative combinations are reaching the right people. Here's how it works. You give us a range of components, images, videos, text, and calls to action. Then, specify who you want to reach and your budget. We'll do the rest. Dynamic Creative automatically determines which combinations work best with any given audience and placement. It's a fast, easy, and cost-efficient way to match the right ads with the right audiences at scale. Most importantly, people will be more likely to see ads that are engaging and relevant to them. And when that happens, they're more likely to take notice and take action. Find your perfect match with Dynamic Creative today.
So this is a product called Dynamic Creative, in which Facebook explains how they sort of use different variations of ad creative to appeal to voters. And across the board, we've seen that political campaigns are resembling tech operations more and more, thinking about whose votes can we, which influencer voters can we ignore, which influencer voters must we reach out to, what regions of the country really matter. And in this day and age in which politics resembles a technological operation, and it's all about this optimization problem, who's deciding what's optimal? And how do we feel in cases like this in which an automated system is making that decision? I'm realizing I'm just a bit behind on time, so we're going to continue now to the influence layer, which is all about how do you use the information that you've collected and the learning from that information to ultimately achieve a political aim that you're interested in. I'm going to skip over the video that I had planned and just show here a couple of companies. Here's a company called NGP Van in the US. Here they're showing Dial Your Way to Victory. And here's another company called CallHub.io, also based in the United States. You can see SMS data collection, use automatic text interactions to collect contact information from subscribers following SMS opt-in. This is a big phenomenon we've seen around the world, automated calling and texting. And this is also happening in Georgia. Shout out to my friend Nino, who sent me these private screenshots from her own phone. She said that during the recent elections in Georgia, quote, it was overwhelming, the volume of texting, and in some cases calling that people received. So here are just a couple of totally unsolicited political messages she received. I'm just going to look at one of them, the one that was in the middle of the previous slide, and I had some trouble translating these. I don't speak Georgian, but this seems to be making a reference to a member of Georgian parliament who's a member of the Georgian Labour Party, but also making a reference to the Patriot Alliance Party, which has been suspected to have been supported by the Kremlin in some way, shape, or form in these recent parliamentary elections. Now, to take a step back and to think about how this fits into disinformation, everything we've talked about so far, like where you're collecting data, what you can learn from your data, how you can use this data to achieve a political aim that you're interested in, there's nothing explicitly about disinformation that's baked into that idea. My big fear is where this world of disinformation intersects and converges with this infrastructure of personal data. We all know disinformation is bad for democracy, but what happens when that meets this infrastructure of private companies that are actually claiming to do nothing bad for democracy, but in fact making politics more efficient? What happens when the information that we're consuming is not only highly personalized, but also false and automated? And I think that it's places like Georgia where I fear this becoming a big problem, where there is an established history of disinformation campaigns, but also this sort of budding technology industry as well. I'm going to play just a short clip from one of the election observers from the recent parliamentary elections in Georgia, and here we go.
The elections were competitive and overall fundamental freedoms were respected. Nevertheless, pervasive allegations of pressure on voters and blurring of the line between the ruling party and the state reduced public confidence in some aspects of the process.
She just said, blurring of the line between the state and the ruling party, and she's talking about events like this one. So here we see from an event at which the Prime Minister and the Secretary General of Georgia attended. And what's interesting about this is just a photo from that event, is that here they are campaigning on behalf of the Georgian Dream Party, but they're at a construction site for a kindergarten that's actually being funded by the state. And this is an example of the distinction between the ruling party and the government, those lines being blurred. In a healthy democracy, the ruling party just occupies the seat of power, the seat of the government temporarily. But it's events like this, Transparency International actually identified 24 of such events just by the Georgian Dream Party during the election campaigning phase before these parliamentary elections in Georgia. And even though this is an analog example, you can imagine how when data enters the picture, this becomes a really tricky problem. Even having information on just voters' phone numbers and which voters are older could allow you to just run a robocalling campaign to advertise to them or to declare to them the incorrect voting date, for instance. Actually, this is a case that my colleagues and I found in Canada. We found a robocall-driven voter suppression campaign. And I think this case is interesting because it's a prime example of where this line could be blurred and how the state can abuse its exclusive access to data. And ultimately how data-driven technologies pose a risk to our democracies. Of course, there are democratic benefits to be gleaned, but also there are risks as well. And I think that's important because ultimately we're holding these elections to decide what kinds of societies we want to live in, and ultimately what kind of democracies, strong or weak, liberal or illiberal, we wish to live in as well. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Applause indeed. If we had a full audience here, we would be hearing very loud applause. Thank you so much for the detailed presentation. I have lots of questions for you, but I'm sure the audience also. So we'll save those for the end. And now we need to turn to Tbilisi, actually, to hear from our second speaker and my very, very good friend, Mikheil Benidze. Mikheil is just starting a new, very exciting program at the Zinc network. He's a chief of party at the new Georgia Information Integrity program. We don't know them yet, so I think this is the first occasion when we will hear a lot about what they have planned. To Zinc Network, Mikheil actually brings 10 years of election monitoring experience. He worked at the International Society for Fair Elections and Democracy, ISFAD, and during the first panel, we actually heard from Nini, who works there also now. Among those 10 years, the last four years, Mikheil was in a leadership role. He was the executive director of ISFED, and he was also the one who pioneered social monitoring efforts during elections in Georgia. We're very thrilled to hear from someone who has direct knowledge about the social media landscape during some of the most recent Georgian elections. He can also tell us how Georgian civil society has risen up to the challenge and what we can expect in the coming years. So, Gamarjoba, Mikheil, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Eka. I hope you guys can hear me. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm really happy to participate in this very original, kind of really disruptive type of conference, which links up Tbilisi and Berlin, but also it happens at the same time, like online and in the studio there with all of you guys present. So I'm really happy to be on this panel, and also happy to be with some of the people that I know very well, and who both colleagues and friends who we have cooperated a lot in over the last several years. So I don't bring actually any of the PowerPoint presentations or the slides. I'm just going to be doing a little bit more of a qualitative talk rather than kind of quantitative or even bringing examples of certain type of social media disinformation stories. But I'm happy that we've heard a lot of those in the previous panel as well, for those who were following. And so I will just be picking up some and trying to understand broader in terms of what are some of the trends that we are seeing in Georgia, which are obviously not just only relevant for Georgia. So since 2016, I think we no longer debate anywhere that social media plays an important role in politics and plays an important role in elections in general. So for a lot of people, it might feel like, why are we constantly focusing on the same issue over and over again, on disinformation, misinformation in social media, and its kind of overlap with the elections and political process. I think it's still very much interesting, after the UK, after the US elections, after a few different elections which have obviously highlighted this challenge, to also look at Georgia. And why it is really interesting case study is because Georgia brings with it an interesting kind of disinformation landscape, in which we have, on one hand, domestic disinformation, as well as we have foreign country, hostile state kind of sponsored disinformation and attempt to influence the political process in the country. So in obviously Georgia is in a very interesting geostrategic location, and since the regaining of the independence since 1991, Georgia has been trying to move towards the Western institutions, and integration with the EU, with the NATO, has become a foreign policy goal for Georgia over the last 17 years. But this obviously doesn't sit very well with the Russian Federation. So we've seen general attempt to influence Georgian society and Georgian voters included. It is not something new to Georgia, obviously, and this has been happening for a long time, including from the beginning of the 90s. Unfortunately, not only through disinformation campaigns, but through active military measures, including in 2008 with the war between Russia and Georgia. But especially since 2008, I think what we are seeing warfare from the Russian Federation, really using the soft power influences and really trying to further the propaganda messages and disinformation and misinformation and information manipulation in this country, which again, Georgia is not the only country where we see this, but Georgia, we can say that, is a bit of a test bed, and Georgians might have tasted this much earlier than many other countries, maybe in Europe, are now facing this challenge. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that unfortunately this information is not just something that's coming from abroad in the case of Georgia. So if in many other countries primarily the focus would be foreign interference into electoral process, and whether social media capabilities are utilized for that. In the case of Georgia, very much so. This is a debate and discussion about the domestic and homegrown kind of disinformation that is quite often even more prevalent and maybe even more impactful than the Russian messages and disinformation that are, especially when we talk about the specific, if we focus on elections, which we are doing in this panel. So and unfortunately, when we talk about the homegrown disinformation attempts and operations, these are not just basically there are different actors also domestically. These are not only the actors that are aligned with the government and the ruling party, but also the actors that are aligned with the opposition parties and opposition powers. And increasingly so, also we have these pro-Russian political parties and opposition parties which are also using the similar tactics. So it's really a kind of a battleground of all sorts of disinformation messages that are kind of countering each other and trying to influence the citizen opinions. So what they have in common is that they're obviously trying to influence the citizens. They're trying to influence the voter behavior, and elections obviously are a crucial point in around which this disinformation, misinformation, and information manipulation usually peaks. However, the case of Georgia has shown that not only elections are obviously the peak points, and basically any political development in between elections also becomes accompanied with this huge wave of disinformation and huge wave of manipulation, especially on social media. The 2018 elections, in the previous panel, actually, Nini talked a lot about it. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I think 2018 presidential election in Georgia was like a best illustration, and especially its second round was the best illustration how this all kind of came together. So we saw in 2018 a competitive presidential election in which a winner was not decided in the first round, and the first round was like very close, very similar results by two top candidates, one from the ruling party, well, one was supported by the ruling party and another one an opposition candidate. And what we saw was that in the runoff period, in just a month between the first and the second rounds, we saw that the number of pages that are spreading that were spreading disinformation and discrediting narratives has tripled in that period of time. And both of the parties or their aligned, their supported actors, their proxies were using this, but this was particularly evident on the side of the government or pro-government actors, which were really engaged in this discrediting campaigns and different type of manipulations on social media, which has started really this snowball effect. So I think starting from that second round, it's not that disinformation or this type of manipulations and discrediting campaigns didn't exist before, but that was kind of a starting point which turned into a big avalanche, which has not stopped, I think, since then. And what this really fuels on is, again, to tie in with the previous panel, in that polarization, and the polarization not only in media, but generally the polarization of the society, and really trying to exploit the genuinely existing differences between these two major political players, the ruling party and the largest opposition party. And some of the supporters really feel very strongly about it. And the whole campaigns are really aimed at amplifying those differences and really trying to fuel that polarization. And so there are different ways how these goals are achieved. The one thing that I want to also mention here is that interestingly, around that same period, we saw in the second round period, we saw that the ruling party has hired Israeli PR strategists, which were helping in this PR campaign, which then turned out to be engaged in a similar operation earlier in Austria, also in Israel, in a number of other countries. So we see that now there's this like black PR type of campaigns, this type of discrediting campaigns are in a way also an international practice that is, and a service that is offered to different actors in different countries. And I think we saw the same actor then in Ukraine in 2019 Ukrainian elections, in the presidential elections. I don't think they were super successful in that one. And that's actually a case study of its own of kind of how in that case the incumbent was not able to use this type of mechanism, but the other way around. So the challenger, Mr. Zelensky, actually really used the social media capabilities. But that's a whole different story that we can probably discuss and explore at a different case. But maybe Rafael can talk a little bit more about that and the experience that you guys have had following this. So how this works, what are some of the tactics that are used? Primarily the discrediting campaigns, so trying to attack the opponent through satire, through some sort of compromising, whether visuals or texts or different type of evidences that are then either taken out of the context or in itself have some sort of controversy, and so those are aimed for at the audiences. Then there are a number of supporting pages, which are which are not officially affiliated with a political party or with a political player, but and pose as if they're independent, voices of the society, but in reality, they, in a coordinated way, in a organized manner, try to promote supporting messages to this or that political party. Then we have more deceptive forms, which are false support, which basically creating the pages or create campaigns which seem like they support political party, but in reality it serves to undermine that very political actor which it pretends to be supporting. So it will, it's a classical kind of manipulative scheme in which there will be a few posts that really are genuine and that share the same type of, or either are shared from the official campaign of an actor, or kind of share the same type of spirit. But then there will be something that is compromising or that is confusing to the actual voters and supporters of that actor, and by that type of content, there is an attempt to deceive them or confuse them. And then there is false media, which was also extensively discussed by Nini earlier. So I'm not gonna go into the detail. But interestingly, exactly like 2018 election was when we saw that not these type of false media pages were not as many actually during elections, but they started growing and multiplying even after elections. So this is no longer just an election period issue, which we are seeing. And on top of so these are more like political tactics that are used. And on top of that, what we see is a constant, maybe less politically related to each and every like political or electoral development, but constant propaganda campaigns and constant kind of spread of divisive narratives, which tap into more values and traditional values and try to, I guess, exploit the sentiments, the traditional sentiments that are in the society like Georgia. And these are, really trying to push and propagate nationalistic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, homophobic content, as well as generally illiberal and anti-Western. And so there we already see, when we were talking about the Russian disinformation and propaganda, there we already see the actors, some of which are directly aligned with Russia, and we know that these organizations, have certain links with the Russian Federation, and are highly likely receiving even finances from Russia. But there are also a lot of actors which may not necessarily be directly aligned with Russia and directly connected with Russia, but they have alignment in terms of some of the values and kind of sharing the same viewpoints, and so they are themselves also kind of amplifying these messages and basically helping spread those narratives. One thing is to say is that all these kind of value-based issues and really propagating them is a way in Georgia to really push for pro-Russian agenda. So a lot that you won't see on Georgian social media, or I mean, you will see, but there will be very limited, the actual openly pro-Russian content, right? A lot of this is masked more in anti-Western content, and even there's less of the openly anti-Western content, but it's more the issue of values. So attacking the West in terms of the values of multiculturalism, in terms of the values of liberal democracy, and trying to undermine those values and undermine kind of commitment to those values in the Georgian society. And what we are also seeing increasingly is that now, given that there are also difference of opinions and like new trends emerging in the Western communities, now we see that a lot of times the narrative of two Wests, alternative like Wests, are portrayed by these actors as well. So you have one liberal West, which are all these horrible people according to this narrative, which are against traditions, against values, against religion, etc. And then you have more, conservative West, and alluding to some of the challenges that we see now even within the European Union, right? In the case of Hungary or Poland, or even rise of populism in general across the world, including the United States. So we see exploiting those as being as portraying that these values, what we are propagating, these are not anti-Western values. These are also Western values, but there are like two Wests, and we need to choose the sides. So what we see here is that both like political as well as these more kind of narrative-based actors are highly coordinated, highly organized. They post at the same time. They have pages that are coordinated. They use groups to spread those messages, and they use both inauthentic as well as authentic accounts to push and to artificially amplify some of these messages. So that's where we see the key problem. And the other problem that we are seeing, especially in the political kind of disinformation and information manipulation, is use of advertisement, political ads, as a way to push these messages. So there we come to the kind of platforms, right? So where is the challenge in terms of the platforms? Facebook calls this coordinated inauthentic behavior, right? This way of organized attempt to artificially push certain type of narratives. And obviously that is the key challenge, these information infrastructures, like, or disinformation infrastructures that we see on the platforms, as well as sometimes exploiting the other capabilities on the platform, including the advertisement. And the whole other challenge, which I'm hoping Rafael will also talk about, is the algorithms, how algorithms kind of amplify some of those messages even more, and push the more controversial narratives high up in the feed. I know that we don't have a lot of time, and we will have time for the question and answer, but what I want to say is that what is happening to counter that? On one hand, we see civil society organizations in Georgia being super active, whether it's debunking, whether it's exposing, analyzing, and demonstrating how this infrastructure works, how these coordinated inauthentic networks work to influence citizen behavior, as well as cooperating with the platforms like Facebook on takedowns, on third-party fact-checking initiatives. And we heard from Tamar earlier, also in the first panel, which was who was talking about this. Georgian civil society was super active to bring the advertisement transparency measures in Georgia, the same ones that are effective, that were effective in other countries as well by Facebook. We are happy that they are now this ad transparency tools are available also in Georgia. It's great that there is also increased response from Facebook. We saw, I think, 5 takedowns focused on Georgia over the last couple of years, and we saw many of those assets which were connected to pro-government or pro-opposition or pro-Russian actors were taken down. But what we don't see is a coherent strategic government response, and the response of the agencies like strategic communication units, which are in different ministries, but it doesn't feel like there is a coherent strategic response to disinformation. There is also more that needs to be done in terms of the media literacy. Again, state response there is very much necessary, and civil societies cannot only do that. But what is outstanding, and I'm going to just stop there, is, so on one hand, what we know is that there is flourishing disinformation. What we think we know is that disinformation affects societies and it has impact. What we don't know is what is that impact, how much of that impact, and how much of it is actually, how much of this disinformation is actually changing people's behaviors and how they act. And in the cases when it is effective, when the disinformation is effective, why is it effective, right? What are some of the experiences of the regular citizens, of the vulnerable audiences, that make it possible that some of those narratives actually make sense, some of those narratives resonate and then affect the audiences. So that's where our project comes. So the Zinc network and the Georgia Information Integrity Program really over the next 5 years, which started just in September, but over the next 5 years, what we are going to do is we're going to really look into the audiences. We're going to understand what is the audience behavior, why certain narratives are resonating, is the disinformation actually making impact, and what is that impact, and very much critically looking also to the civil society. Is the civil society, and are those great products that the civil society are creating, are those actually making impact as well? And then based on that knowledge, how we can make a better impact, how we can engage different parts of the society in tackling this challenge, and not just civil society or not just media or not just separate actors. I'm happy to elaborate on this further into the questions, but I know that we are out of time, and I don't want to take too much of Rafael's time in the next intervention.
So much, Mikheil. Very thought-provoking talk. We'll pick up on many of the things that you started talking about, I'm sure, during the Q&A. And here again, I would encourage our audience to ask their questions in the chat. Our third and final speaker, Rafael Goldzweig, comes from Brazil. His interest in digital electoral campaigns peaked during the US presidential election of 2016, at the time when he was studying at the Hertie School of Governance here in Berlin, where we also met and became friends. He started with analyzing the patterns of Twitter used by the populist politicians in the US, France, and Germany, and since then has been studying, collecting evidence and working to understand that evidence on how social media impacts elections all around the world, as well as the democratic discourse. He's doing that in his role as the research coordinator at Democracy Reporting International here in Berlin as well. While Rafael is perfectly familiar with the Georgian context and can comment on many of the things that we're talking about today, it's better if we hear from Rafael about the trends that he and his colleagues have observed elsewhere. So take it away, Rafael.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eka. Is it working? Yeah. And thanks for the Disruption Lab for this invitation and the event. It's highly relevant, and I'm very happy to share the panel with Varoon and Misha as well. I didn't actually get on purpose so much in the Georgian context because I know the work that Misha did there, and actually the discussions we had influenced a lot of our thinking. And in the past, we collaborated in a few projects, so I think it's interesting for me to actually take the step back in a way and show this global perspective, because when we talk about disinformation in social media, we talk about a global problem that everybody was aware. If someone was doubting that this was a problem, COVID-19 showed to everyone that this was really a global challenge that everyone had to deal with. And because it's a global problem, we need to have a global understanding, the nuances in each country, and what are the possible solutions to tackle this at scale. And I will try to end on a positive note, showing how I see the solution to this question moving forward, which goes a lot in line with what Misha mentioned. But I think it's important to depart from what Varoon presented, that this is an industry and it became a business model to some extent. So I think it's interesting that we take all this knowledge into consideration before thinking about the solutions. And as Eka mentioned, I work for Democracy Reporting International, which is an organization that deals with traditional aspects of democracy, constitutional building, support to parliaments, and observation of elections. And in the past 3 years, the digital sphere presented more and more a challenge for electoral integrity around the world. So the digital democracy portfolio from DRI was actually structured more or less 3 years ago, and we departed from a perspective that we wanted to mainstream social media observation into electoral observation, because electoral observation exists already around the world to look into the rights of candidates and parties, and to look at like how media covers candidates. And in a way, social media was a black box. Nobody knew what was happening there. And we started like doing these exercises about like how to monitor social media, what type of data do we need to do that, how can we mainstream this activity so that more and more organizations and actors around the world can do this work. So we departed from this perspective, and we moved over the past years to establish connections, networks, and trainings on this issue. And over the past year, we have been involved in discussions about 2 pieces of legislation at the EU level, which is the Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan, which come as a response to this role of tech companies in this new infrastructure of disinformation and influence. So in a way, I will touch upon a few of these points and learnings over the past 3 years in my presentation. Yeah, good. So here's a few of the outputs that we have. As I said, we have the yellow guide with Misha was part of the discussions when we had this discussion about how to create a methodology to monitor this online space. But we look also about the political implications. So at the EU level, in the context of the European parliamentary elections, there was a code of practice against disinformation. So the first official response from the EU side on how to deal with this type of content. So we critically assessed that. And we are also looking forward. So in a way, we have in our portfolio how new technologies and different ways of manipulating public perception can be used in the future. And that's the role of artificial intelligence, with Misha mentioned with the role of algorithms, but also on the content creation side of things. Everybody learned about deep fakes and artificial intelligence creating content, so we also look forward. I think that's an interesting way for us to show how we see this problem. And lastly, this is one of the few products that we actually launched in partnership with Forset and a Georgian NGO, and it's actually a toolkit to monitor social media, which we aim to kind of bring more people and more organizations on board to actually learn how to do that and bring more evidence to this debate, which is basically the base that we believe that policy making should be done. So understanding what's happening around the world so that we actually can bring and shed light to this phenomenon. Our portfolio includes more than 10 countries, but this is some of them that we looked in 2019. And we monitor several different aspects, from disinformation to traditional electoral coverage, but also hate speech online and the role of political advertising in this whole infrastructure. So by bringing this evidence, and I will show only 4 of these cases, we can understand what is global in this problem and what is specific to some of the countries, and how should we approach that in terms of the response, like who's responsible for what in turning the online space more free and fair space for political discussion, especially around elections. So with that experience, we really had a few learnings, and I think that's what I try to bring, this global perspective here. Like Misha mentioned, the Georgian election and the report from MISFAD in 2018 really showed this very well, also with visualizations, that networks that aim to influence elections, they become very active around electoral periods, because it's very clear what's at stake. Like elections, you have seats at stake, you want to push a candidate. Varoon really showed very well this infrastructure around testing different messages, and so official and unofficial actors are very active around elections. There is a lot of money flowing to this type of campaign, so of course we will see this activity of networks trying to influence political behavior, be it legally or illegally or in the gray zone, because there is no law ruling on that. It's very active around electoral periods. They tend to kind of reduce in intensity after elections are over, but the point here is that those networks, official and unofficial, they exist throughout the year across platforms, so Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, so they are really out there to actually influence political behavior around the clock. So when we talk about elections, it's one specific moment, but we have to bear in mind that this goes beyond this time. And this is more or less a visual representation of what I meant. If we imagine that this graphic shows number of posts or even interactions, we can see that approaching to electoral periods and a bit before, we see an intense activity of those networks. But of course, they are there also to respond to other political big events or disasters. And as I mentioned, COVID was one of those events that we really witnessed a spike in disinformation. But in moments of terrorist attacks or the burning of the Notre Dame Cathedral, all those political events generate a lot of polarization on social media. And that's important to understand, that we shouldn't only look at solutions that would deal with this problem around elections, because most of the times they are there to reinforce polarized narratives. So yeah, as I mentioned, and I think elections are tip of the iceberg when it comes to this phenomena. And the type of narratives and manipulation attempts that we see around election periods are very much in line with messages trying to suppress votes, to question electoral integrity, saying that the elections were rigged, like we could witness right now with the US elections. We also see attacks between candidates. They might be legal or they might be undercovered and shared by false pages, and really trying to polarize this electoral environment. But beyond that, we have to understand that this online space is actually influence people's values and beliefs over time. So I think polarization, in the case of Georgia and in my home country, Brazil, I think we see that some of those narratives really push polarization over time, which can have influence, for example, and effects on this growing political apathy that we are seeing around the world. So it's really a matter of like taking care of this phenomena over time. And I think ultimately we talk about worldviews because as much as you can just play with people's values and beliefs, we are witnessing right now an increase in beliefs on conspiracy theories and really like discrediting scientific evidence that like 5 years before we didn't believe that people would actually, that those ideas would actually come to the mainstream. And I think this is, we have to see this as something that like adds over time. So of course you're being witnessed with this narratives, and at some point you end up believing in conspiracy theories. And the problem is that it pushes people outside of the democratic discussion. If we don't agree with a baseline of facts, we cannot discuss ideas in politics. So that's actually something that ultimately is a problem that we see with this whole phenomena going forward. So I will show you very quick inputs from our evidence around the world so that we can think about like, okay, what's happening in Georgia? It's like a lot of the elements that Misha mentioned, we also witness around the world with our research. And some of the things, as I mentioned, are very similar in each country, and others are quite particular, but it gives some food for thought for us to understand exactly how disinformation campaigns are playing a role. And I think in a way we looked at the infrastructure and why this is happening, but like here's more or less exactly the strategies and the ways in which this takes place. So Myanmar is a very interesting case. If people follow this debate, Myanmar was a country where in 2017 a genocide happened against the Rohingya, a Muslim minority in the country. And the question with Myanmar is that, of course, this problem predates social media, but back then Facebook got a huge increase in spike in users, and the content that was shared on social media in Myanmar was not properly moderated and not properly taken care of. And the UN fact-finding mission pointed out to the role of Facebook in facilitating or giving space to malicious actors or even the military empowered to actually spread hateful narratives on social media for a few months. So Myanmar became this big case study when we talk about human rights and the role of social media. And we have an office in Myanmar dealing with different other aspects of democratic transition. And we did a long project looking into social media manipulation in the country, and more recently in the elections that took place in November 2020. So the key findings that I present to you are very recent, but we are about to also launch a final report on the what we observed in the elections. But what is interesting to mention is that disinformation in Myanmar was mainly pushed by these junk news sites, gossip and celebrity pages. So we really observed pages that had an intention of like sharing, you know, entertainment content, but approaching elections or moments of high political discussion, they turned and shared political content every now and then that were presented in inconsistencies or were false. It's very difficult to say whether there is an official political purpose behind that, or if they are financially motivated, because most of the times some of the websites, they create clickbaiting content so that they attract more users. So it's very difficult for us to understand exactly the reason behind, but whenever we analyze this, we can have an idea if they're consistently pushing for some narratives, or if they are just doing political content every now and then to get some audience. But what we observed that this content was actually pushed by pages on Facebook specifically created to discuss topics of national security and internal conflicts in the country. So really those pages were either thematic, talking about those issues, or they were very unclear, like pages that shared recipes or music pages or like meme pages. So it was really an infrastructure that many times they also share this type of content in a coordinated manner, as Misha mentioned about this coordinated inauthentic behavior. So you don't know who's behind the pages, but you know that this message is being pushed consistently through different pages. We also observed the role of government pages and political party pages in spreading positive narratives about the leader of the country, Aung San Suu Kyi, when she went to defend the country against genocide accusations at the International Court of Justice. So this was also interesting to understand that the coordination happened with official pages from parties and the government, and we didn't observe a very strong participation in the online debate from civil society organizations. So it's really an interesting, kind of finding that we saw that those official pages were actually having a lot of voice, but civil society organizations not so much. We also saw COVID-19 health misinformation being used against minorities, and the role of groups on Facebook really being important to push this type of narratives. Sri Lanka was quite interesting because it's also a country that has a lot of nuances when it comes to hate speech being used on social media. And we also saw the same trend of gossip and celebrity pages sharing this type of content on social media, but also false pages pushing for content, nationalist content and hateful content. In most times in our analysis, we saw them actually receiving more attention than political pages from parties, candidates, and even official media pages, which was quite worrisome in some cases. Yeah, we observed also the discriminatory languages and language in this case. And in fact, Facebook actually apologized for their role in Sri Lanka and Myanmar for both of those cases of hateful content being shared, and that they stepped up, really bringing up more monitoring and solutions to the recent elections. An interesting fact that we also observed in Sri Lanka, but Tunisia was more of a case, is that when monitoring elections in 2019, we realized that this whole campaign environment was full of official and unofficial pages pushing for messages, but was interesting to see that unofficial pages actually were running political advertising. So they were earning money to push for ideas between different candidates. And basically those pages were allowed to run ads in the campaign silence period, which is this moment where you cannot campaign on social media. And it was interesting that this happened also in Sri Lanka, is that even those pages on social media, even official pages, were also running ads in moments where the Electoral Commission mentioned that it was not legal to do so, which really showed the fact that, like, even when laws exist, they are sometimes not respected in this campaign environment. So this was something that is important to take into consideration if we think about laws, is that enforcement is a big part of it, and it so far has proven very difficult to do in different countries around the world. And lastly, I like to bring the case of Pakistan, because we looked into not only Facebook but Twitter as well, understanding, and we saw that pages actually casting doubts on the electoral process were mainly created 2 months ahead of the elections. So we really saw that there was an agenda behind discrediting the electoral process. And we took a gender perspective on Pakistan and really looked into the fact that female candidates were being much more harassed than male candidates, and whenever they were compared between the two groups, we saw that female candidates were harassed using derogatory terms and sexist approaches, whereas male candidates were much more questioned on their political integrity. So really showing nuances that some groups might be more affected than others when we're talking about, like, electoral influence and defamation on social media in those processes. So this is a bit of like this around the world. It just took you a bit very quickly around the world with some evidence, but just to show that social media I think that some messages should stick to this evidence that I presented, is that social media is a very big and unlimited space and very dynamic. So it's very difficult for us to understand exactly what's happening there. So the more transparency we have and the more people monitoring, the better for us to understand what is happening and what solutions we can actually bring to the table. And I think this global perspective is important because, as Varun mentioned, sometimes we take a very US-centric approach and many times European approach, but not bringing those elements from a global perspective to the table is very, it doesn't cover all the problems and it doesn't cover the solutions that we actually have to bring to the table. So, and a solution is not very easy. So it's not easy, there is not one single way of dealing with this, and I will quickly show what can we do with that. Like, so if it's a black box, if it's very difficult to monitor, what can we do to solve this problem? So my main aspect is that this problem has different elements. So it can go from technical aspects from the platform designs to elements that actually push messages at scale, such as advertising or bots in this space, to content-related challenges, which relates to disinformation and hate speech. So all of them have different solutions and approaches that can be brought to the table by different actors. So what I want to emphasize is that there is no silver bullet to this problem, and that this is inherently a multi-stakeholder responsibility. So Misha mentioned the role of civil society. Tech companies are often there to provide some of solutions, and governments also have a role. I'm not going to get into detail about each solution because we have time to discuss in the Q&A. But in all, I think governments have the responsibility or should have a role in actually providing more transparency and making accountability from the side of tech companies something more mainstream. So really, we need to have access to data. We need to have a bigger understanding of what's happening in this environment, and governments have the role in actually asking for this transparency elements to be put in place. Civil society has also a role of watchdog, both about what tech companies are doing and also what governments are doing, because governments often can step the boundaries and create laws that actually can harm civil society and freedom of expression. So civil society is a core element to hold into account both actors in this dynamic. And tech companies, they need to create products and solutions, provide data to researchers and transparency. But more than anything, they need to actually enforce their community standards and bring a systematic approach to takedowns on those coordinated networks and actually bringing really showing that they actually include applying their community standards in the way that they describe them. Because if you read the community standards, you see that a lot of what's happening right now, it's not allowed by platforms, but enforcement, again, is the problem. So I will leave it here. I have the example about the European discussions on that, but maybe we can just have a discussion later. Otherwise, I think I will run a bit out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael, for taking us all over the world, indeed, and all those examples. We'll come back to a discussion on how to design the most effective approaches and hear about the experience in the European Union as well, in Brussels. But before that, I want to come back to Varun. So both Misha and Rafa were talking about the role of civil society, increased awareness, around misinformation and disinformation on social media during elections or outside of the elections. Can you speak to what that means in the context of, so for example, Cambridge Analytica scandal, to which you also referred, has really opened the eyes of a lot of the people around the world who perhaps may have not been interested so much in studying this issue as much as you guys were before, didn't have a professional interest. Did that translate? Do we know if that translated into increased digital literacy, and whether or not that matters, and how much is the industry also getting smarter the more aware we become?
Yeah, definitely. I think you know, one of the things that makes working on this issue so challenging is that I feel like sort of responsibilities have just been shifted into this giant circle of dependencies. So I feel like on the one hand, many of us voters are just so quick to click I agree to any products and services we use online, trusting that our interests and our data is going to be handled properly and appropriately by legislative authorities. Lawmakers, on the other hand, are making laws that are often very vulnerable to technological circumvention. Misha mentioned earlier, to just kind of these more kind of mischievous or sort of misleading kind of tactics of employing things like satire to continue doing what you're trying to do. So I think lawmakers are in this position of trying to make laws that then companies can find ways to circumvent. Companies, on the other hand, I've talked to many venture capitalists about their interests in trying to adhere to more respectable privacy and security standards. They seem reluctant to impose any restrictions on their budding portfolio companies, and then the companies at the end are just saying, well, we're just doing what our users want us to do. So it's created this frustrating web of dependencies, I think, because at the end of the day, that's translated to a public cost. Who's paying for the ways in which our democracies are being undermined by technology? Well, ultimately, it's us voters. But it's all not bad news, because I think, Cambridge Analytica has had some benefits. One of the things that I think is good about it, things like the social dilemma being widely viewed, I think these are a bit more of the public conscience. I think that too much of the focus, in my opinion, is on how effective are these technologies, and not enough of the focus is on, regardless of how effective or ineffective something like psychometric profiling is, at the end of the day, what does that reveal about the intentions of someone seeking political power? And I think it underscores the central fact that the solution to this problem is obviously going to require a lot of engagement from civil society, but it's really a multi-pronged effort. I think that civil society, we need to work on digital literacy efforts for voters. I think there's a big component involved with that. I think, secondly, companies do need to be designing products and services that are more conscious of these issues, and lawmakers as well. Obviously, we need a lot of legislative interventions, and as Rafa just mentioned, I think the legislative interventions that make sense in Georgia might be very different from the ones that make sense here in Germany.
Thank you. Let's turn to Misha again. So Misha, in your conversation, in your talk, you were making references to the first panel, to the conversation that the conference that we had earlier in the morning. Can you talk a little bit about the direction of the relationship between polarization and misinformation and disinformation on social media? Would you say that misinformation and disinformation on social media mirrors the political divisions and social divisions in our societies, or is it the other way around? Can you speak a little bit about the relationship?
Sure. My impression is that, of course, there is an existing existing polarization in the society, which is in a way reflected in social media. That's something that we cannot deny. But at the same time, I feel like the conversations on social media are a bit more narrow context. Sorry, I'm really hearing my echo back, so I'm slowing down a little bit. So the social media usually, in my opinion, more amplifies this polarization rather than that necessarily mirrors what's going on in the society. So we are already in the context where social media is obviously quite widespread. But in the countries like Georgia, we have to keep in mind that not everyone has access to the internet. And then of those who do have access to the internet, they are not necessarily on social media platforms. And even if they are, I think the ones that are engaging in this conversation and kind of driving the polarization further are the ones that are feeling a bit more on the extreme sides, and that they feel like they have to express themselves. So the next panel will be talking about the hate speech, and I think especially that's really relevant in that context. I think the people are really radical in the case, are really vocal if they are really radical, right? And sometimes it also often, a lot of people who do not share that same opinion feel a bit, do not feel comfortable to express a different opinion, to challenge that radical idea, because they feel like they're going to get attacked, right? So so that it also suppresses some of the conversation. So I don't think like the polarized discussion on social media is necessarily reflecting the reality, but it's definitely amplifying that. Especially, as Rafa mentioned, the same we have seen here is that those kind of unofficial pages that are pushing this type of narratives are actually paying a lot of money to spread those messages, to spread that discrediting campaign further. So there is certainly an organized attempt to make it look like this polarization is much larger. But one thing that we have to be aware about and to keep in mind is that the discussion on social media often affects the discussion than in mainstream media, and this is also something that was mentioned by Nata earlier in the first panel, in which she mentioned how traditional media sometimes picks up the social media posts of different people as if it's a fact, and then that then has its own way of influencing much larger society and really kind of driving that polarization further up. So I feel like it's hard to give you a like definitive answer. That's again something that we need to research further, and I feel like a lot of this, especially when it comes to Georgia, I'm talking about the Georgia context, is that there's a lot of things that we assume we know, but we need to have more conclusive data on that on those issues, and that's really something that's missing, and we hope to kind of fill that gap moving forward. But that's kind of my impression of what I can give you as a response to that question.
Thank you. Well, what do you? We heard a lot of country examples from you, Rafa, but we haven't heard about your home country, Brazil, which is another very interesting case study, right? So, how would you? How do you feel? Polarization and disinformation happens in the Brazilian context, and what is perhaps maybe the relationship of the two, between the two in your home country?
Yeah, it's definitely. Maybe I don't speak a lot about Brazil because I get depressed when I do so, but yeah, I think like this societal polarization and what I have been witnessing in the past years in Brazil has always been like this. It's this question that goes hand in hand. Does like social media play a role in increasing polarization, or is this a societal phenomena? Which I think it's both. Like we cannot say that like it's one or the other, much like in Georgia. And I think it's interesting to see like. You remember my thesis was about, I compared 4 countries and 12 candidates in 4 different countries to see how they were campaigning on Twitter. And basically my findings were that the radical language of populist candidates were the ones that actually received more attention on Twitter across different political contexts, which means that sensationalistic content and very strong opinions and sometimes hate really benefits from the system where sensationalized content gets more attention, because that's how algorithms and social media work. And I think this was very much the case in Brazil. And it is worth noting that Bolsonaro got elected in Brazil, and his campaign was the cheapest one in history, if I'm not mistaken. Also, he didn't have any time on television at all because his party was so small and not represented. So that he didn't have space on television, and he didn't have a lot of money in his campaign. And he ended up winning against all the traditional odds, which per se is not a bad thing, because if we're talking about digital forms of communication, reducing the costs of campaigns, electoral campaigns, which is such a big problem around the world, that is a positive trace. But like, if this is done through mechanisms that actually push for division, polarization, and hate, that might not be the case that we are so happy about that. So I think, again, for that example really shows that the good and the bad sides of new forms of communication, but of course, polarization is on the rise. it's difficult to say how they exactly influence because of lack of research and lack of evidence that we really need to understand a bit more. But what is true is that, as I mentioned in my presentation, we are seeing a rise in conspiracy theories and a rise in a lot of discredit about scientific knowledge. So this is something that is built over time. And if you were bombarded by those narratives over time, of course, we will lose a lot of people from this informed, fact-based discussions. And the question is, how are those networks influencing users not only across different platforms, but also across different age groups? So we know right now that there are a lot of different platforms that influence political behavior in many senses. So you have YouTube and TikTok, who are a very video-based approach. You have Instagram, which is image. You have also Instagram stories, or you also have posts and news websites that are being shared on Facebook. So it's quite complex, and we need to understand the nuances about when are those campaigns trying to polarize society. I have a 12-year-old brother right now, and it's very funny because I get a glimpse of how it is to be young nowadays and use social media, and he actually has 16,000 followers on TikTok with dog posts, so he's not politically trying to convince anyone. But it's interesting to see how it's a change in the way we use those platforms, and we don't understand at all how political influence on the age group of my brother is being actually, I don't know what's happening on his feed, you know, like, so I think it's very important to emphasize that we need to learn much more about what's happening there to come up with better conclusions, but unfortunately it's a trend that is rising around the world.
Very young too, Rafa. I believe we have some questions from the audience. We're of course, very keen to discuss how to increase oversight and how to hold them to account, either companies or the political actors who are abusing the digital infrastructure. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to do that in the second part of the Q&A. I believe Tatiana has some questions from the audience for us.
Yes, actually, first I wanted to ask a question myself, then we can pass to the audience. Because I was really interested on the aspect that Mikheil was touching about the impact of disinformation. So since you are also trying to analyze and monitor that, so if you could tell us a bit more if actually disinformation is creating a real impact and how, because I remember also when there was the case of Cambridge Analytica, one of the big discussion was also how much was actually able to impact concretely. So I think if we learn the extent of this impact, we can also try to learn better what are the solutions.
That was for Mikheil, I think, right?
Yes. Are we collecting questions, or should I go ahead? Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there again, we do have specific evidences from across the world. And I think Varoon earlier was talking about the attempt to misinform voters about the voting date. I think this is not just an example of Canada, but I think we have seen the same thing in Brazil and in other countries. So if we look at the slide that Rafael had earlier, there are specific points of impact, whether it's on the election day itself. So there might be like a really targeted campaign to affect citizens in that kind of peak point, which is a crucial point. I think there are also then attempts and impact in a way for in this electoral period. But what's more important, I think, and where it really has impact is those values kind of and beliefs set, which happens in a broader period of time, not just during the election day. So we do have some of that research, for example, coming from periodic polls done by CRRC Georgia and NDI, public opinion polling of Georgia, in the case of Georgia, where we see that certain number of Georgian citizens, a certain percentage of Georgian citizens say that breakup of the Soviet Union maybe wasn't a good development, geopolitical development, and maybe there some people saying that maybe there are membership in the Eurasian Union or otherwise aligning with Russia is potentially a kind of a path for Georgia, while this may not be a mainstream opinion. It feels like over time, instilling some of these messages about the values, about the about portraying the West negatively does impact the societies, right? But a lot of this is still, a lot of the evidences we have are still more or less anecdotal, and it's still hard to exactly measure that impact, how much of this or that disinformation piece will have an impact on the society. I think what we have to keep in mind are two things. One is, what are the vulnerabilities that the society has, and why, like, what's behind the narrative that they believe. And quite often it's usually the economic situation or some sort of specific problem that they're facing, which then is exploited by the messages that are really very much targeted. So I mean, I can bring an example, which is, over the last several years especially, we see actively anti-Turkish narratives in Georgia, and it has like different kind of dimensions, so I won't go into a lot of details, but the whole idea is basically to divert attention from the ongoing Russian occupation of the Georgian territories to Turkey, and to kind of play with the historic sentiments and historic vows of Georgian society, with past Ottoman Empire's kind of dominance over some parts of the Georgian territories. And so this is very effectively instrumentalized and said that, if Russia is an occupier country, then Turkey also is, because, they historically they have taken some of the territories from Georgia. But this specific narrative is very well used and instrumentalized in an ethnic Armenian community in Georgia, in specific region, in Samtskhe-Javakheti region, in which it takes a different shape, and it now in that case plays on the again historic grievances between Armenia and Turkey, and really targets the ethnic Armenian population, saying that Georgia joining NATO will mean that Turkish military, which is also, Turkey is a member of NATO, will then have presence in the Georgia territories, in this region where there is a military base, and so that will be, affecting your daily lives as an Armenian community. And this, there are certain things that this type of Russian, especially Russian propaganda and disinformation, is really tapping into. And we have to see what are those vulnerabilities, what are the lived experiences of people who are sometimes exposed to this disinformation, and then how we can address those challenges, which are reality, nurturing and providing the fertile ground for that impact of disinformation. I'm not sure if I answered it, but it's my long way of answering that question, Tatiana.
Questions from the audience? I think Lika is prepared to share some.
Yes, so there was one question, also kind of a statement, and it's quite a big question, so maybe you could answer it briefly since we don't have too much time. But this person would like to know from you, what do you think we must do to prevent fake news in media and also social media like Facebook? And then this person wrote that he feels that the government must also do something against it, for example, regulations, because it seems like social media platforms won't ever make any real action against it.
Quickly answer to that. It's very complex and I didn't show, but right now there are these two pieces of legislation on the European context. Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan, they are actually being launched in December, the first drafts. And the question, so far, dealing with those challenges of hate speech online and disinformation has been dealt with by voluntary codes of conduct and codes of practice. Those codes basically pushed for more transparency in the way that tech companies were actually dealing with this type of content. But as the name says, it's voluntary. So basically, the lesson learned from those two codes is that the EU is seeing a few areas in which they want to regulate. And my personal perspective is that regulation should push a lot to the side of transparency and accountability. So basically showing what data needs to be shared with civil society and researchers for us to understand this field a bit more, what are the internal processes and actions that tech companies are taking to counter this problem, and shed more light on this aspect so that we create more societal accountability. I think it's very difficult for a government around the world to actually rule on the content side of things. So I particularly don't think that the government should define what's true or not, or what's true or false, or what's the line between acceptable and not acceptable speech. Because as much as this might work in a few countries around the world, legislations like this have been used to actually curtail the freedom of expression of journalists and activists. So I think it's very dangerous to go through this route of beyond transparency and accountability. So it is a challenge, and I think over time we will continue seeing this type of challenges, but it is important that a push like this is being done at the EU, because it is a group of countries, and I think this problem is much better dealt with by an international/regional approach, because a country alone cannot establish standards for a global company like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, whatever, any other company that will show up later. And we are not seeing a lot of those pushes coming from the American government, for example, which is, if any, the government who would have any sort of like impact on that. So I believe that it's worth looking at what's happening at the EU level, and worth pushing for this legislation to really address most of these issues, because there is still time for participation before those acts are being adopted next year. So I really welcome everyone to take a look and take a part in the discussions that are happening.
That's actually a perfect segue also to something we wanted to discuss earlier with Varoon. We just heard what Brussels is doing, for example, to hold tech companies accountable or to try to regulate this sphere a bit better. How does it compare and contrast or supplement perhaps the efforts in Washington, D.C., and what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think as I was saying earlier, and I think as all of us are saying, I think we're going to need interventions on multiple fronts. You just mentioned Washington, D.C. It reminded me of when I was there a few years ago. At this point in time, there was some discussion about the Honest Ads Act. It had passed the House, but not the Senate. And it's this piece of legislation that's trying to bring more political transparency to political ads. And I was at this conference, and I was sharing a beer with a political consultant based in D.C., and he was sort of saying, laughing to me, half joking really, ha ha ha, even if the Honest Ads Act passes, here are the 3 plans I have up my sleeve to do exactly what I'm doing right now, while just checking off the disclosure boxes I would need to for that new piece of legislation. And I think that's one of the big challenges here, that new legislation that's introduced, I think not only are there going to be these sort of technological workarounds and even legal workarounds. I was talking to someone recently who told me that she works at a law firm, and her big task right now is helping companies basically circumvent GDPR effectively. I think there are going to be a lot of efforts when there's so much money at stake to sort of not obey or not respect the spirit of the law. But I think that underscores the need for legislators to, I think, understand this problem as an infrastructural problem, as a business problem, but also I think to understand which pieces of this are uniquely U.S. The Democracy Action Plan that's being rolled out here in the EU. I think it's sending a sign that there is a different sort of tolerance for these sorts of issues. I was speaking to some people who work at an NGO based in New Zealand, and they were saying that even high-up-ranking members of New Zealand government see the large role that social media and tech platforms are playing in politics as too much an imposition of American values or American ways of doing things on New Zealand politics. So I think obviously the first step to solving any problem is defining the problem and acknowledging the problem, and I think that's a lot of what's going to determine the success of these interventions, is whether we can define the problem properly, and I think in advance anticipate the ways in which the solutions that are rolled out are going to be worked around.
I think we don't have that much time, but maybe one final question to Misha, if he can respond maybe in like 30, 40 seconds. What is the next step for, so like we just heard from Varoon and from Rafa as well, what's been kind of debated, some of the solutions that are being debated in the EU as well as the US, whether or not they might be effective or not. What is your take? What needs to change beyond and outside of Georgia for, what kind of changes would you like to see happen outside of Georgia in the next few years?
I mean, there was a lot of discussion already about the regulation, and I agree completely that regulation, I mean, there needs to be some sort of regulation that is going to the tech companies in broadly, and so there I think US and the EU have the power to kind of drive that discussion, and it's great that that discussion is happening or starting to take shape, yeah. But in the local level, obviously, as it was mentioned a number of times, we have to be really careful because certain type of regulations can be used exactly to curtail the freedom of speech. And also, especially when we have this kind of convergence of domestic and foreign actors trying to use similar tactics. And unfortunately, when some of the domestic actors are affiliated with the government actors, there's a high likelihood that there will be trying attempt to, use some of those regulations for political benefit. There has to be, as it was mentioned earlier, kind of multi-stakeholder, triangular, or even more angles relationship between the civil society, between the state institutions and the government, as well as the tech industry. And the tech industry has to be also more, I guess, aware of the local context, not only during elections. And it's great that this is starting, and this has started. But I think there needs to be a much deeper understanding of the local context, much better collaboration with these other stakeholders. And again, I agree that there is no silver bullet. We are all kind of playing a bit of a reactive role. And with the technology, the disinformation, and all the kind of ways to do this are advancing. But we have to somehow find this collaborative approach and bring different stakeholders to work together.
Way to end the conversation, actually, perfect way for wrapping up. Luckily, we all know each other. This is also evidence to how well this collaboration has already started. This is a small space. You're exchanging a lot, experiences from other countries with each other. And this will continue, obviously. So the strategizing will have to continue after this conference and in the years to come, in your new role, Misha, in your current roles, Varoon and Rafa, and Transparency International also is here to help hold the companies that we can expose as abusing their power to account. So thank you very much for a very insightful conversation. I learned a lot. I hope our audience also enjoyed it. And I believe we are handing over to Tatiana to close this session. Thank you.
Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you, Eka. It was a very important panel to have in this context. I am here just to introduce what is happening next. And of course, first I wanted to thank all of you. We will go on in around 1 hour. The next panel is at 4:30, that is 7:30 in Georgia. And the title is Hate Speech and Human Rights. So we will speak also about the form of discrimination and hate towards vulnerable people, LGBT communities and women between Georgia, and also we will have the perspective from Germany also related to hate speech. And at the end we will connect again with the Regional Democratic Hub Caucasus that has been working with us for this conference as part of the exchange. So thank you very much, and I remind the audience to come back because there will be again the possibility to ask questions to the speakers, and thank you again for your participation.